The dust on Elias Thorne's boots was as thick and old as the lines etched around his eyes. He stood on a rise, the wind whipping at his threadbare duster, surveying a ranch that was more ghost than home. Every splintered fence post, every sagging beam of the barn, screamed of a losing battle. Elias, a man hardened by years of sun and silence, felt the weight of it all pressing down, a familiar ache in his bones. This wasn't just land. It was his legacy, a testament to generations of Thornes who had coaxed a living from this unforgiving earth. Now it was slipping through his calloused fingers, piece by agonizing piece. He was a rancher, born and bred, but the cattle prices had plummeted. The last 2 winters had been brutal, and the bank's patience had worn thinner than his last pair of chaps. Every morning, the sun rose on another day of impossible choices, another day of watching his dream wither. He'd tried everything, selling off a few head, cutting back on feed, even taking on odd jobs in town that chipped away at his pride. Nothing seemed to stem the bleeding. His ranch, the only thing he'd ever truly known, was on the brink of collapse. The silence of the empty corrals was deafening, a constant reminder of what he was losing. His nearest neighbor, Old Man Potter, had been hinting for months. Potter, a shrewd man with more land than he knew what to do with, had offered to buy him out piece by piece until nothing was left. Elias had refused, stubbornly clinging to a hope that felt increasingly foolish. He wasn't a quitter. He was a Thorne, and Thornes didn't sell their land. But pride didn't pay the bills, and desperation was a cold companion. He needed a miracle, or at least a practical solution. The thought had been festering in his mind for weeks, an idea born of sheer despondency, yet it persisted. A mail-order bride. The concept felt alien, almost shameful, to a man who'd always prided himself on his self-reliance. But Potter had mentioned it, half-jokingly, suggesting it was a way to get an extra pair of hands, maybe even a loan from a dowry. Elias had scoffed then, but the idea had taken root, growing in the fertile ground of his desperation. He'd seen the advertisements in the back of the regional newspaper, small type promising companionship and a new life. Most of the women looked prim, proper, city-bred, entirely unsuitable for the relentless demands of ranch life. Then he'd seen her advertisement, tucked away at the bottom, almost an afterthought. It wasn't a photograph, just a description. Alora. Strong-willed, independent, deemed too wild for conventional marriage. Too wild. The words had resonated with something deep inside Elias, a flicker of understanding for a spirit that refused to be tamed. The description hinted at a woman who wouldn't shy away from hard work, someone who understood the untamed nature of life itself. The advertisement also mentioned a small inheritance, a dowry she was willing to put towards a new beginning. That was the crucial part, the lifeline he desperately needed. It wasn't about love, not yet anyway. It was about survival. It was about saving his ranch. He knew the risks. He knew the absurdity of it all. He was a man who preferred the company of horses to people, a man whose life was dictated by the rhythm of the land, not by delicate social graces. Yet he was out of options. The thought of a stranger, a woman labeled too wild, stepping into his quiet, solitary world was unsettling, even terrifying. But the alternative, losing everything, was far worse. He had sent the letter a terse, almost gruff invitation, outlining his circumstances with stark honesty. He hadn't embellished, hadn't promised anything beyond a roof and hard work. He had simply laid out the truth. He needed help, and she seemed to be offering it. The reply, when it came, was equally brief, a single line agreeing to the arrangement. Now, she was due to arrive on the stagecoach tomorrow. Elias stared out at his struggling ranch, the setting sun casting long, desperate shadows. He was buying a woman he knew nothing about, a woman deemed too wild, all to save a dream that was dying. He had no idea just how wild she truly was, or that her untamed spirit might be exactly what he needed to breathe life back into his desolate world. The dust, a fine, relentless powder, coated everything. It settled on Silas's weathered hat, caked his boots, and even seemed to thicken the air he breathed. For 3 years, that dust had been his constant companion, a gritty reminder of the drought that was slowly, inexorably strangling his ranch. Every morning, Silas watched the sun climb over the parched horizon, its rays baking the already cracked earth, and every evening he watched it dip below, leaving behind a sky devoid of rain clouds. Silas McAllister wasn't a man given to despair, not openly, at least. His jaw was set, his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, held a stubborn glint. He'd inherited the sprawling, yet struggling Double M Ranch from his grandfather, a man who'd carved out a living from this unforgiving land with sheer grit. Silas felt the weight of that legacy, the unspoken expectation to keep the dream alive. But the dream was fading, wilting like the sparse grass in his pastures. He walked the fence lines daily, his gaze sweeping over the skeletal remains of what were once lush grazing lands. His herd, once robust, had dwindled. He'd sold off half his cattle last spring, a gut-wrenching decision just to buy enough feed to keep the rest alive through the lean months. Now, even that feed was running low, and the well, his only source of water, was barely a trickle. Every dip of the bucket brought up less, muddier water. The silence of the ranch was a heavy thing, broken only by the mournful lowing of a cow or the creak of the windmill, turning uselessly in the hot, dry wind. Other ranchers in the county had already given up, their land foreclosed, their dreams turned to dust. Silas had seen the empty homesteads, the signs nailed to gates, stark declarations of defeat. He refused to be one of them. He was a McAllister, and McAllisters didn't quit. Yet, the reality gnawed at him. He was alone. His foreman, old Jeb, had finally packed up and moved to town, his arthritis making ranch work unbearable. The few hands Silas could afford were transient, drifting in and out like tumbleweeds, never staying long enough to truly invest in the land. He needed help, real help, but every penny was earmarked for feed, for taxes, for simply surviving another day. One sweltering afternoon, Silas rode into Redemption, the nearest town, its main street a ribbon of baked earth. The general store was his usual stop, a place to pick up supplies, and, more importantly, to listen. Rumors, like dust devils, swirled through Redemption, and Silas often found nuggets of information that could prove useful. Today, however, the air was thick with a different kind of buzz. Outside the saloon, a small crowd had gathered. Silas dismounted, tying his horse to the hitching post, his boots crunching on the gravel. He heard snippets of conversation, hushed and curious. Auctioning off. Orphans. Not many left. Orphans? Silas frowned. The county orphanage, a struggling institution itself, occasionally sent out children for adoption or, in desperate times, to work as indentured servants. It was a grim reality of the frontier, a last resort for those with nowhere else to go. He'd never considered it. He had no need for a child, certainly not with his current struggles. As he pushed through the small throng, the scene before him solidified. A stern-faced woman from the orphanage stood on an upturned barrel, a small group of children huddled nervously behind her. They were thin, their clothes patched, their eyes wide with apprehension. Most were young boys, their faces smudged with dirt. But then Silas saw her. She was older than the others, perhaps 17 or 18, with a defiant tilt to her chin and eyes that seemed to hold the untamed spirit of the wild mustangs he'd occasionally spotted on the distant mesas. Her dark hair was braided, but a few rebellious strands had escaped, framing a face that was both striking and hardened by circumstance. The orphanage woman cleared her throat. "We have a few more children available for placement," she announced, her voice flat and practiced. She listed off the boys, their ages and perceived strengths. Then her gaze fell upon the girl. A sigh, almost imperceptible, escaped her lips. "And then there's Cora." The ripple went through the small crowd. Silas heard whispers. "Cora, the wild one? Too much spirit for a man to handle, they say. She's been returned twice." The orphanage woman continued, her tone resigned. "Cora is. Spirited. She requires a firm hand and a great deal of patience. She's strong, good with animals, but she has a stubborn streak that some have found. Challenging. She didn't look at Cora as she spoke, but Cora met the gazes of the onlookers head-on, her expression unreadable. Silas felt a strange pull, a flicker of something he couldn't quite name. He wasn't looking for a wife, certainly not a spirited one. He needed a ranch hand, someone to help him fight the land, not another mouth to feed or another problem to solve. Yet, those eyes, so fiercely independent, held his attention. He saw a reflection of his own stubbornness, his own refusal to break. The auctioneer began to call for bids on the children, starting with the youngest boy. Silas, however, couldn't tear his gaze from Cora. He had no money for such a venture, no logical reason to even consider it. But logic had little to do with the sudden, inexplicable urge that seized him. He didn't know it then, but this seemingly impulsive decision, born of a fleeting connection in a dusty town, would be the most pivotal choice of his life, setting him on a path he could never have foreseen. The auctioneer's gavel struck, a sharp crack that echoed in the dusty air of the livestock pen. Silas watched the last of the yearlings trot out, sold for a pittance, just enough to cover the immediate feed bill and little else. His pockets felt lighter, his heart heavier. The decision to attend this particular sale, to even consider buying, still gnawed at him. It felt reckless, a betrayal of every sensible bone in his body. Yet, the image of that girl, her eyes holding a defiance that mirrored his own stubborn will, had taken root. He had promised himself he would simply observe, gather information. He needed a strong, capable hand, someone who understood the brutal realities of ranch life, not some city-bred dilettante. A woman, especially one with a reputation for being too wild, seemed the antithesis of what his struggling ranch demanded. But then, he remembered the way she held herself, the unyielding set of her jaw, even in such a degrading circumstance. There was a flicker of something in her gaze, a raw strength he hadn't seen in a long time, not since his grandfather. Silas walked away from the main auction pens, his boots crunching on the gravel. He found the separate, smaller enclosure, almost hidden from the main thoroughfare. A few curious onlookers lingered, their whispers carrying on the dry breeze. He saw her then, standing apart from the others, her back ramrod straight, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon, as if she could see beyond the confines of the dusty town. Her clothes were plain, worn but clean, and her hands, though small, looked capable, calloused. The auctioneer, a portly man with a booming voice that seemed out of place in such a subdued setting, began his spiel. He spoke of her age, her general health, and then, almost as an afterthought, mentioned her spirit, describing it as unbroken, difficult to manage. A few snickers rippled through the small crowd. Silas felt a surge of something akin to anger. This wasn't a horse or a cow, but a human being reduced to a list of attributes and flaws. He listened, his expression unreadable, as the bidding started, sluggish and hesitant. The price remained low, ridiculously so. No one wanted trouble, especially not in a woman meant for domestic duties. But Silas wasn't looking for a domestic hand. He was looking for a partner, someone who could stand shoulder to shoulder with him against the encroaching dust and despair. He needed someone with fire, not someone easily extinguished. His initial offer was a surprise, even to himself. It was higher than anyone else had bid, higher than he had intended. A few heads turned, eyes narrowing in speculation. The auctioneer, sensing a genuine buyer, picked up the pace, his voice gaining enthusiasm. Another man, a local rancher Silas knew to be a hard taskmaster, counted his bid. Silas hesitated for only a fraction of a second. The rational part of his brain screamed at him to stop, to conserve every last cent. But the image of his wilting ranch, the dwindling herd, flashed before his eyes. He needed something, anything, to break the cycle of slow decay. He raised his hand again, his voice firm as he called out a new, even higher figure. The other rancher grumbled, then shook his head, conceding. The gavel fell with a final decisive thud. "Sold!" the auctioneer bellowed, pointing directly at Silas. A ripple went through the small crowd. Silas ignored them, his gaze fixed on the girl. She turned slowly, her eyes meeting his. There was no fear in them, no resignation, only that same fierce, unyielding defiance. A jolt went through Silas, a recognition of something kindred. He had bought a problem, perhaps, but he had also bought a chance. A chance at something different, something that might just turn the tide. He had no idea what he had truly committed to or how profoundly this single, impulsive act would reshape his entire world. The journey back to the Double M would be long, and the true challenge had yet to begin. The journey back to the Double M felt longer than any Silas had ever undertaken. The sun beat down with an unrelenting fury, turning the already dusty road into a shimmering mirage. Every mile seemed to stretch into an eternity, the silence in the wagon broken only by the rhythmic creak of the wheels and the occasional snort from the horses. Silas kept his gaze fixed on the horizon, a knot of apprehension tightening in his gut. He had made a decision, a big one, and now the reality of it settled over him like a suffocating blanket. He had committed to something entirely unknown, a gamble of the highest stakes. The ranch, his legacy, hung in the balance. As the familiar outline of the Double M's main house finally appeared in the distance, a fresh wave of anxiety washed over Silas. What would this new arrangement truly entail? He had bought a chance, yes, but what if that chance brought more trouble than salvation? The thought gnawed at him, a persistent echo in the quiet of his mind. Ranch was exactly as he had left it, parched, quiet, and burdened by the weight of the drought. The well, his lifeline, was still just a trickle. The cattle, thin and listless, huddled under the meager shade of the mesquite trees. Silas knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he was running out of time. This drastic measure, this unconventional solution, was his last resort. There was no going back, no other options left to explore. Unloading the wagon, Silas moved with a practiced efficiency, his movements economical, his expression grim. He didn't speak, not even to himself, the weight of his responsibilities pressing down on him. The silence of the ranch, usually a comfort, now felt oppressive, amplifying his every doubt. He fed the horses, watered them sparingly from the dwindling supply, and then walked the perimeter of the ranch, his eyes scanning for any sign of change, any hint of rain that might have miraculously appeared in his absence. There was none. The sky remained a relentless, cloudless blue. As dusk settled, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Silas sat on his porch, the same porch where his grandfather had often sat, watching the sun set over the land they both loved. He nursed a cup of lukewarm coffee, its bitterness a fitting match for his mood. The air was still, heavy with the scent of dry earth and desperation. He thought of the decision he had made, the one that had felt so impulsive yet so necessary at the time. It was a leap of faith, a desperate gamble in a game where the odds were stacked against him. Silas considered the implications, the whispers that would undoubtedly spread through the small community. He was a man of routine, of quiet hard work, not one to make rash choices. Yet, here he was, having taken the most unconventional step of his life. He felt the burden of expectation, not just from his grandfather's legacy, but from the very land itself, demanding that he find a way to make it thrive once more. The ranch was more than just property. It was a living, breathing entity, and it was suffering. The night deepened, bringing with it a deceptive coolness. Silas remained on the porch, staring out at the vast, dark expanse of his land. The stars began to pepper the inky sky, distant and uncaring. He knew the coming days would be challenging, perhaps even more so than the ones he had already endured. But he was Silas McAllister, and he would face whatever came, just as his grandfather had before him. The true test of his resolve, and of his desperate gamble, was about to begin. The following morning, a thin, almost ethereal mist clung to the ground, a deceptive veil over the parched earth. Silas stood on his porch, a cup of lukewarm coffee clutched in his hand, watching the sun burn away the last vestiges of the fog. He felt a familiar knot of apprehension tighten in his gut. Today was the day. The auction. The day he would either find a lifeline or watch his ranch, his legacy, slip through his fingers. He'd barely slept, his mind replaying every failed attempt to find water, every disheartening report from the cattle market. He walked to the corrals, the familiar creak of his boots on the dry earth, a constant reminder of the drought's grip. His remaining cattle, gaunt and restless, milled about, their lowing a mournful chorus. He ran a hand over the rough hide of an old steer, feeling the sharp points of its ribs beneath his palm. These animals, once the pride of his herd, were now a testament to his struggle. Selling them off, piece by piece, had been like tearing pages from his own story. He'd done it to survive, but the cost, measured in the dwindling numbers of his herd, was immense. The journey to town was a silent one, the rumble of the wagon wheels on the dusty road the only sound. Silas's gaze swept across the familiar landscape, once vibrant and teeming with life, now a stark panorama of brown and gray. Every withered mesquite, every cracked patch of earth, whispered of the relentless dry spell. He thought of his grandfather, a man who had faced his share of hardships but had always found a way. Silas wondered if he possessed the same resilience, the same unwavering spirit. The auction yard was a cacophony of sounds, the lowing of cattle, the whinny of horses, the shouts of men, and the incessant chatter of the crowd. Silas felt a prickle of unease as he dismounted, the air thick with anticipation, and the acrid smell of dust and animal. He saw other ranchers, their faces etched with the same weariness he felt, some openly despairing, others clinging to a fragile hope. He knew many of them were in the same predicament, their futures hanging by a thread. He found a spot near the back, leaning against a rough-hewn fence post, his hat pulled low. He watched the proceedings, the auctioneer's rapid-fire cadence a relentless drumbeat. Animals were bought and sold, fortunes made and lost, all in a matter of minutes. Silas felt a growing sense of dread as the prices for even the healthiest stock remained stubbornly low. The drought had hit everyone hard, and the market reflected the widespread desperation. His last hope, the sale of his remaining cattle, seemed to dwindle with each passing bid. Then the auctioneer's voice boomed, announcing the next lot. Next up, a truly unique offering. A young woman, strong of limb, spirited, and ready for a good home. Comes with a strong work ethic, though a touch. Independent. Labeled too wild by some, but perhaps just in need of the right hand to guide her. What am I bid for this spirited lass? A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd, a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Silas felt his jaw tighten. He'd heard about these marriage auctions, a grim tradition born of necessity in these isolated parts. He found them distasteful, a stark reminder of the raw desperation that permeated their lives. Yet he couldn't tear his eyes away as a young woman was led into the ring. She stood, tall, her chin defiantly lifted, her eyes, even from this distance, blazing with an untamed fire. She was certainly spirited, perhaps even reckless, but there was something in her gaze that spoke of an unyielding strength. He saw the subtle tremor in her hands, though, a flicker of vulnerability beneath the fierce exterior. The bidding began, hesitant at first, then gaining a slow, reluctant momentum. Silas listened, his mind racing. He had come here for cattle, for a chance to save his ranch, not for this. Yet, as he watched the bids climb, and saw the dismissive glances some men cast her way, a strange, unexpected thought began to form in his mind. It was a desperate, outlandish idea, born of desperation and the gnawing fear of losing everything. He knew it was a gamble, perhaps the biggest one of his life, but he was Silas McAllister, and he was out of options. The thought, once a fleeting whisper, solidified into a resolute decision. The days that followed were a blur of frenetic activity for Silas. He moved with a renewed purpose, a stark contrast to the slow, heavy steps he'd taken for months. The decision to seek help, to gamble on an unknown solution, had somehow lifted a weight from his shoulders. He spent hours meticulously cleaning the old cattle trailer, patching rusted spots, and greasing the ramp. It wasn't much, but it was all he had, and it needed to be ready. He even polished the worn leather of his best saddle, a small, almost superstitious act of preparation. His neighbors, when he finally spoke to them, offered a mix of pity and skepticism. Old Man Hemlock, his closest ranching neighbor, just shook his head. "Silas, you're chasing ghosts. Ain't no woman gonna fix what this drought's done." But Silas, for the first time in a long time, found himself immune to their well-meaning doubts. He had seen the desperation in his own eyes, felt the cold grip of failure, and he knew he had to try. The drive was long, the miles stretching out like an endless, dusty ribbon. The truck, an ancient Ford, rattled and groaned with every bump, but Silas pushed it onward. He had never been this far from the Double M, and the unfamiliar landscape, though still parched, felt alien and intimidating. He clutched the crumpled newspaper clipping, its ink smudged from countless readings, the advertisement for the specialty livestock auction, a beacon in his mounting anxiety. When he finally arrived, the auction yard was a cacophony of sound and smell. The lowing of cattle, the whinnying of horses, the pungent scent of manure and dust. Men milled about, their faces etched with the same weariness he felt. Silas felt a surge of unease. He was a rancher, not a trader in human souls, yet here he was, driven by the same desperation that forced men to make impossible choices. He found the designated pen at the far end of the yard, tucked away from the main livestock. A small, almost timid woman stood inside, her eyes wide and wary, like a cornered wild anima. Her clothes were simple, practical, but worn. Her hair, the color of rich earth, was pulled back in a severe braid. She wasn't what he had expected, not the wild creature he'd imagined from the rumors. She simply looked tired. The auctioneer, a portly man with a booming voice, began his spiel. He spoke of her strength, her resilience, her ability to work tirelessly. He painted a picture of a woman perfectly suited for a harsh life, a woman who wouldn't break under pressure. Silas listened, his heart pounding a strange rhythm against his ribs. This wasn't just a transaction. It was a gamble on a life, both hers and his own. When the bidding began, Silas hesitated for only a moment. He had come with a set amount, a sum that felt enormous, a sum that represented his last true hope. Other bidders, a few rough-looking men, offered paltry sums, their voices dismissive. Silas, with a sudden surge of conviction, raised his hand. His voice, usually quiet, rang out clear and firm. $200. A hush fell over the small crowd. $200 was an unheard-of price for a contracted woman. The auctioneer's eyes widened. Then he pounded his gavel. Sold. To the gentleman in the dusty hat, Silas walked forward, his legs feeling strangely heavy. He met her gaze, and for the first time, he saw something beyond fear, a flicker of curiosity, perhaps even a hint of defiance. He extended his hand, a gesture of respect rather than ownership. "Silas McAllister," he said, his voice a little rough. "We're going to the Double M." She nodded, a subtle, almost imperceptible movement. She didn't speak, but her eyes, deep and knowing, seemed to hold a silent question. Silas knew, in that moment, that this was only the beginning. The biggest gamble of his life had just paid off, at least in the first hand. Now the real work began. The dust, ever present, still coated the land, but now a different kind of energy crackled in the air. Silas, his face etched with a newfound determination, stood on the porch, watching the first rays of dawn paint the sky. The previous day's gamble, the one he'd taken on a wild spirit and a shared dream, had indeed been just the beginning. The real work, as he'd known, was a relentless march forward. He walked the familiar path to the barn, the worn leather of his boots scuffing the dry earth. The silence that had once felt heavy with despair now held a quiet hum of purpose. Every morning, Silas and his new companion rose before the sun, their days a blur of motion. They mended fences, Not just the physical barriers, but the metaphorical ones that had long isolated Silas in his struggle. They cleared irrigation ditches, painstakingly diverting the meager well water to new, more efficient channels. Silas found himself talking more, sharing his plans, his fears, and even his small victories. The words flowed easily, no longer trapped behind the stoic wall he'd built around himself. The well, once a symbol of his dwindling hopes, now seemed to respond to their collective will. The trickle became a steady stream, enough to green small patches of pasture, enough to sustain the remaining herd. Silas watched the cattle graze on the nascent shoots, a flicker of hope igniting within him. Each day brought new challenges, new setbacks, but they met them head-on, a united front against the unforgiving land. Silas marveled at the resilience he saw, not just in the land, but in himself, mirrored by the fierce spirit beside him. One sweltering afternoon, a familiar rumble echoed in the distance. Silas looked up, his heart quickening. The sky, a vast, empty canvas for so long, was now gathering clouds on the horizon. Not the wispy, teasing clouds that offered false hope, but dark, heavy formations, pregnant with the promise of rain. He felt a surge of emotion, a mix of disbelief and overwhelming gratitude. It wasn't just the rain. It was the culmination of their tireless efforts, a testament to the belief they had placed in each other. The first drops hit the parched earth with a hiss, raising a faint, earthy scent. Then the sky opened. The rain fell in sheets, a cleansing deluge that washed away the dust, the despair, and the lingering fear. Silas stood on the porch, letting the cool water soak his skin, his face tilted towards the heavens. He wasn't alone. He felt a hand slip into his, strong and calloused, yet comforting. The storm raged, but inside, a different kind of peace settled over the ranch. The next morning, the world was transformed. The air was fresh and clean, the earth a rich, dark brown. Green shoots were already pushing through the softened soil, vibrant and alive. Silas walked through the rejuvenated pastures, the mud squelching beneath his boots. The cattle grazed contentedly, their lowing a sound of quiet satisfaction. He looked across the vast expanse of his land, no longer seeing only the struggle, but the potential, the future. The ranch was still a formidable challenge, but it was no longer a burden he carried alone. The true gamble, Silas realized, wasn't just about survival. It was about opening himself up, about finding a partner who saw the same wild beauty in the untamed land and in him. He had faced the drought, not just of water, but of spirit, and emerged, not unscathed, but undeniably stronger. The Double M Ranch, once on the brink of collapse, was now a testament to enduring grit, shared dreams, and the quiet power of a new beginning. Silas knew, with absolute certainty, that this was just the start of their story, written in the newly softened earth, and the promise of a boundless horizon. The last embers of the campfire pulsed, casting long, dancing shadows across Silas's face. He watched the flames, the memory of the past few months a vivid, almost tangible presence beside him. The ranch, once a decaying monument to his father's failures, now stood strong, its fences mended, its cattle thriving. It wasn't just the land that had healed. He had too. The bitterness that had corroded his soul, the fear of repeating history, had slowly, painstakingly begun to recede. He thought of the drought, that relentless enemy that had almost broken him. The parched earth, the dying livestock, it had felt like a curse, a confirmation of his deepest anxieties. But then the rains had come. Not a gentle shower, but a deluge that had tested the very foundations of his spirit. He remembered the desperate nights, shoring up the barn, guiding the cattle to higher ground, the sheer exhaustion that had threatened to consume him. Yet, through it all, he hadn't broken. He had pushed through, driven by a stubborn refusal to surrender. That refusal wasn't born of pride alone. It was born of a new kind of strength he hadn't known he possessed. It was the strength found in shared burdens, in unexpected alliances. He had learned to ask for help, a lesson that had been harder than any physical labor. He had learned to trust, not just the land, but the people who stood with him. The ranchers from neighboring spreads, once rivals, had become allies, their shared struggle forging a bond stronger than any individual ambition. They had weathered the storm together, their collective resilience a testament to the enduring spirit of the West. The most profound change, however, wasn't in the land or the community. It was within himself. He had come to the ranch carrying the heavy mantle of his father's legacy, a legacy of debt and disillusionment. He had seen himself as a solitary figure, destined to fight his battles alone. But the land, in its unforgiving honesty, had taught him otherwise. It had shown him that true strength lay not in isolation, but in connection. He reached for the worn leather-bound journal he kept by his side. Its pages were filled not with ledgers of loss, but with observations of the land, records of growth, and plans for the future. He no longer saw the ranch as a burden, but as a living entity, a partner in his journey. The cattle, once mere commodities, were now part of a larger ecosystem he was dedicated to nurturing. The silence of the night was broken only by the crackle of the fire and the distant lowing of cattle. He felt a profound sense of peace, a quiet contentment that had been absent for so long. The struggle wasn't over. The West would always present new challenges, but he was no longer afraid. He had faced his fears, confronted his demons, and emerged stronger, more whole. The ranch was more than just land. It was a home, a testament to resilience, and a living, breathing promise of a future he was finally ready to embrace. He was, at last, where he was meant to be,